All right, so a few words on thesis statements in timed analysis essays before we work on revising the essays that we completed for the prompt about Hamlet's first and second soliloquies in Act 1. So if you open up the document that has a chart with the grading scale, or sometimes we call that a rubric, I'm going to go through that a little bit with you so that you can see why your score is what it is on your paper, and then what you can do to improve it, because the task is to take your thesis statement and your intro that you wrote on the time situation and improve on it. So first, before I go through the list of the different score points, I want you to make a note in your notebook about how there's a difference between an introduction and a thesis. So a thesis is a part of an introduction. The thesis is the core of your answer or your response to the topic that was given. If the topic has two parts, like this one does, then you need to make sure that your thesis answers both of those parts. For example, this one says you need to write about how Hamlet has shifted in his attitude from his first soliloquy to his second, but you're also expected to write about how Shakespeare uses techniques to make that obvious. So the thesis has to respond to both of those topics. Now, in some situations when you're writing an essay, you have a lot of time. If your instructor gives you, a class period or, like a homework assignment to write an essay and it's not limited in its time scope, then you would be expected to write a complete introduction, meaning that you'd write a whole paragraph where the beginning sort of works your way into and gives some background information, and then the thesis is at the end of that paragraph. That's in a setting where you're not timed. When you're timed, you don't have time to craft that kind of an introduction. When there's a time situation, like on the AP exam, when you only have 40 minutes to read a passage, figure it out, and construct the entire essay, you don't have time for that. So we have to kind of cut certain parts off of our task so that we can accomplish it in the time that's given. So one of the ways that we can do that is by letting our thesis pretty much be the intro. You don't have to worry about crafting some sort of flowery beginning to your AP essay because A, it's going to be analytical, and B, everybody understands that it's a first draft of an essay that you had limited time to complete. So I say, write a good thesis. It needs to be solid anyway because you need to use it to refer, to control your paper. But you don't have to start off with, something glorious like there are many types of dramas in literature. You don't need to do that. Just start with, in Hamlet by William Shakespeare, Hamlet is characterized as, and then that's it. That's all you need. You can skip right to the thesis is what I'm saying. So keep in mind that the task and the circumstances around the task have a lot to do with the kind of intro you're going to create. So let's just assume for the rest of this discussion that we're in a timed situation like we were for this essay, and all we really need is a thesis statement for our intro. We're going to do all the work and the explanation in the body paragraphs. All right, so let's go through the chart. The chart starts with a score point 9 and works its way down to a score point 1, but do keep in mind that you can get a score point 0 if it's a completely blank piece of paper, if it's written in a different language, really odd circumstances like that. You decide to draw a picture instead of writing, all of that is a 0. So let's start with the 9. This is the top level paper. Now we're just looking at descriptors for the thesis statement. When I went through your paper, I only looked at your intro. And so the score that you'll see, I think I used a blue marker right next to your intro, is where I'm saying that your thesis is on this scale. And our job today is going to be to improve that. So let's go through them and then you can see where you might want to improve. So the 9 is a thesis that is artful and insightful, and you can highlight that there on your copy of the scoring guide. These are observations of Hamlet's shifting attitudes that are well crafted. The word choice describing Hamlet's attitude shift is very appropriate and specific and shows a lot of insight and understanding into the text. And if you look to the right, you can see the example. In Act 1, Shakespeare introduces his complex protagonist, Hamlet, as in despair over the death of his father and confused about the marriage of his mother to his uncle. However, through the use of diction and metaphor in two soliloquies, Shakespeare highlights Hamlet's epiphany and resurrects his inner ambition. So a lot of this 9 has to do with word choice. Complex protagonist, highlights Hamlet's epiphany, resurrects his inner ambition. All those things are true, but it's a more artful way of saying he got motivated, right? So notice that we're using terminology that we've studied in class, like protagonist and epiphany and things like that. So a 9 is going to be, like the fairy dust sprinkled and all the words are just falling into place beautifully. An 8 is a thoughtful and perceptive response. You can see that I've highlighted those two words to help you remember what an 8 is. So an 8 is excellent. Beneath the numbers on the left-hand column, you'll see those are sort of like gradebook equivalents in my mind. I'm not going to put an 8 in the gradebook. I'm going to put a 93. So that's what that's there for. So back to an 8. So an 8 is well stated, very perceptive, understands the passage, and can articulate it in a thesis statement. I'm going to let you read that example on the side if you need to. All these examples, most of them I took from student papers. So the only one that I had to do was the 9 because there weren't any 9s, but there will be after today, right? Number 7. Okay, so the 7 score is clear, intelligent, says something interesting and smart about Hamlet's change in behavior and his attitude. The descriptive words are well chosen, as are the techniques that Shakespeare uses. So the example on the side says, the soliloquies of Act 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet showcase a shift in Hamlet's attitude from feeling sorrowful and suicidal in Scene 2 to exhibiting rage and vengeance in Scene 5. Shakespeare creates this change through his use of emotion, metaphor, and punctuation. Okay, so you'll notice a few things about this that make it a 7, which is a very good paper. So one thing is that it really precisely hits on the description of Hamlet's attitude in each one of the soliloquies. Sorrowful is very specific. It's better than sad because it's a certain kind of sad. Suicidal, I think we kind of have to mention that for the first soliloquy because he spends a long time talking about that. And then rage and vengeance are also very specific. But notice also that the 7 thesis is setting up the techniques that Shakespeare uses and using one that's different than what was given. So that's inventive and well chosen. This one is going to talk about punctuation. That paper, when I went on to read it, was about the use of exclamation points and how that helped to shift the tone and Hamlet's attitude from the first soliloquy to the second. So choosing a different technique than what's given on the paper can sometimes elevate your paper because you perceptively saw something that wasn't given there on the page, on the prompt. All right, a 6. So we're getting to the bottom of the top-level papers, but it's still a top-level score. So it says, thesis items like Hamlet's shifting characteristics and Shakespeare's techniques are accurate and precise. So you can see that we've gone from artful and insightful at a 9 to thoughtful and perceptive, then clear and intelligent. Now we're just at accurate and precise. So you can see that the expectation is changing as we go down through the score points. The 5 also says accurate, but then at the bottom of the description it says the observation, although accurate, is superficial, common, or maybe even simple. We always think of a 5 as like a superficial paper, a paper that gets the job done. It's not wrong, but it's not particularly insightful. It's kind of like if you've been paying attention in literature class, you should be able to write a 5. So this one says, in Act 1 of Hamlet, Hamlet undergoes a transformation from being sad to wanting revenge that can be seen in the first 2 soliloquies. Shakespeare uses emotion and repetition to accomplish the shift. So it's pretty basic. It's not wrong. And let me point out that depending on the body paragraphs and how well the person deals with this topic, this paper could be elevated from a 5, but as it stands, the thesis is like a 5. So if I was reading this, I would say, okay, well, it looks like it's about a 5, but let the body convince me if I should go up or down or stay at a 5. The word sad is pretty general, kind of like the same as happy, kind of juvenile. So I think anybody who had understood the two soliloquies and Hamlet's changing attitude would be able to write that thesis. So it's baseline. Now when we go down to the 4, 3, 2, 1, we start seeing papers that have problems. And so they're not passing if we look at the gradebook situation. So anything in the lower half is not an acceptable paper. So 4 says thesis is vague, limited, or brings in information that is unnecessary. Sometimes people spend time talking about stuff that doesn't really go to the point, and that needs to be eliminated. You only want to stick to the things that you're talking about in the paper. There's an example on the side that you can look at. 3, thesis is missing. So a 3 has holes. A 3 is literally missing part of the answer. So either they didn't give specific descriptions of Hamlet's two attitudes, or there's no discussion at all or inclination of what the writer's going to put for Shakespeare's techniques to create the attitude shift. So literally there's something missing. On the side you can see 2 examples of that. In Act 1 of Hamlet, Hamlet's character transforms from a depressed, rude, and upset person in Scene 2 to a motivated, vengeful character by the end of Scene 5. That would be a good thesis if it had another sentence explaining how Shakespeare uses techniques, because remember there's 2 jobs in this prompt. But it doesn't, and so it can only be a 3 because it only addresses the first half of the prompt. The second example there in the column says Shakespeare demonstrates Hamlet's sadness through emotion and repetition. Likewise, if that's the only thesis, then what's missing is a description of Hamlet's change in attitude. If you put those 2 together, it would probably be a 5 or a 6. But leaving out half the job in responding to the prompt is not going to be a passing paper. The 2 description says that it's incorrect. Now, we didn't have any of these because we worked through the soliloquies together first. There was a homework assignment. Everybody had a chance to think about what was going on to prepare you for the prompt. In the future, I will be doing that less and less. You need to be able to read whatever's put in front of you and analyze it. So there is the potential that you could misunderstand something that you read and end up with a thesis that is a 2 because you have incorrectly understood the passage. And that's what we're talking about with the 2 there. And then the lowest score, the 1, is so weak that it just doesn't even really do the job. Maybe they just restate what the prompt says, like this example. It doesn't offer techniques, it doesn't offer descriptions, it just basically says Shakespeare uses a variety of techniques, not which ones, to show that Hamlet has an important shift in attitude between his 2 soliloquies, but it doesn't say what the shift is, so that would be a 1. But let me point out that a paper can start with a poor thesis and work itself into an acceptable paper if the body of the paper does more specific work. If it starts off with a 2 thesis, it probably can't do that because it's going to be a misreading. But a 3, could maybe go up to a 5 if the body paragraphs are, good and solid and start to do some of the things that body paragraphs should do. So the task for today is to look at your thesis statement that you have. I may have made some other comments on there. I tried to underline where I saw that you were describing Hamlet's attitude in the different soliloquies, and I also tried to underline where I saw you mentioning the techniques that are used by Shakespeare. And I want you to look at the score point that you received and look and see above that score point, how could you improve it? And you're going to write an improved paragraph, and then we're going to staple it over the old paragraph so that we've got a little bit of a makeover situation going on. So how could you take that 5 and turn it into a 7 or an 8? How could you take that 7 and turn it into a 9? How could you take that 1 and turn it into a 5? So that's the task for today.